Imagine walking through a maze of narrow, gas-lit streets in 1888 London. It's past midnight in Whitechapel, one of the city's poorest districts. Fog hangs low, footsteps echo on wet cobblestones. Somewhere in the darkness, a man stalks the most vulnerable women in the city, silent, unseen, and devastatingly efficient. Within a few short months, he will slaughter at least 5 women with such ferocity that seasoned police officers will be physically sick at the crime scenes. Newspapers will dub him a monster, a demon, a ghost. But history will remember him by a name he never spoke aloud: Jack the Ripper. How did this killer terrorize an entire city at the height of the British Empire, then vanish without ever being caught? In this video, we'll peel back the fog of Victorian London, step inside the investigation, and ask, was Jack the Ripper a genius predator, or a product of a broken society that almost wanted a monster? To understand Jack the Ripper, we have to understand the London that created him. In 1888, the East End was a powder keg. Whitechapel was crammed with recent immigrants, casual laborers, sex workers, and families surviving day to day in filthy lodging houses. Overcrowded tenements, alcoholism, violent crime, and disease were everywhere. Respectable Victorian society treated the area like a dumping ground, out of sight, out of mind. Policing was underfunded, social services were almost non-existent, and many women turned to sex work simply to pay for a bed for the night. When the murders began, the press pounced. They sensationalized every detail, turning the killer into a dark celebrity. The case exposed class hypocrisy, xenophobia, and misogyny at the heart of the empire. In this video, we'll reconstruct the timeline of the murders, explore the victims' lives, dissect the evidence, and examine the leading suspects, separating fact from myth in one of history's most enduring mysteries. Before the name Jack the Ripper hit the headlines, there were early warning signs. In the months leading up to the canonical murders of 1888, Whitechapel saw a string of brutal attacks on women, some involving throat slashing and abdominal injuries. These earlier crimes, often called the Whitechapel murders, may or may not be linked, but they set the stage. The victims were poor, marginalized women, many struggling with alcohol dependency and unstable housing. Their deaths drew little attention outside the East End. Police were overworked, records were scattered among different divisions, and communication was slow. Then, in late August 1888, a murder took place that would change everything. Mary Ann Polly Nichols. Her mutilated body was discovered in Bucks Row, and suddenly the pattern became too brutal to ignore. Newspapers seized on the horror, the public became obsessed, and the Whitechapel killer began his reign as the most infamous predator in Victorian history. Mary Ann Polly Nichols is often cited as the Ripper's first canonical victim. She was 43, separated from her husband, struggling with alcoholism, and living in common lodging houses, a typical profile for many East End women. On the night of August 30th, 1888, she was turned away from her lodging because she lacked the few pennies needed for a bed. Witnesses later recalled Polly saying she'd soon earn the money on the streets. In the early hours of August 31st, her body was found in Bucks Row. Her throat had been cut twice, and her abdomen was mutilated. The brutality raised alarm, but police initially treated it as a particularly savage local crime. The scene was not secured to modern standards. Potential evidence was trampled or lost. As the sun rose over East London, few realized this wouldn't be an isolated tragedy, but the first drop in a coming storm of terror. On September 8, 1888, just over a week after Polly Nichols's murder, another woman was found dead, Annie Chapman. She was 47, living in dire poverty, often selling small items and sex to survive. That night, she too lacked the money for a bed in her lodging house. Annie's body was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her throat had been deeply slashed, and her abdomen was opened with shocking precision. Some organs appeared to have been removed. The mutilations suggested the killer had some anatomical knowledge. or at least experience cutting flesh. Unlike Polly's comparatively secluded spot, Hanbury Street was a busy residential area. The idea that someone could commit such a horrific crime so close to sleeping families terrified the city. Rumors of a monster spread. For the first time, newspapers suggested the work of a single sadistic killer hunting the women of Whitechapel. The murders of Nichols and Chapman drew attention, but what happened on the night of September 30th, known as the double event, cemented the killer's legend. Just after 1 a.m., Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish-born sex worker, was found in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street. Her throat was cut, but there were no abdominal mutilations. Many investigators believe the killer was interrupted, forced to flee before completing his ritual. Less than an hour later, and less than a mile away, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. Her injuries were the most severe so far: throat cut, face slashed, abdomen opened, and organs removed with alarming speed. 2 murders in one night sent London into absolute panic. Patrols were increased, vigilante groups formed, and the press escalated its coverage to fever pitch. The killer seemed to be taunting the authorities, roaming freely despite a city supposedly on high alert. Amid the mounting terror, letters began flooding police stations and newspaper offices. Most were obvious hoaxes, scribbled threats from pranksters and opportunists, but a few stood out and helped shape the legend. The most famous is the Dear Boss letter, received by the Central News Agency in late September 1888. Written in red ink, it mocked the police, described future mutilations, and signed off with a name that would echo through history. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. It's unclear whether this letter was genuine or a journalist's fabrication, but it was quickly publicized. Then came the saucy Jackie postcard and the gruesome From Hell letter, mailed with half a human kidney, supposedly from victim Catherine Eddowes. The crude, semi-literate note bragged about frying and eating the other half. Authentic or not, these communications transformed the killer into a mythic figure, a self-aware villain performing for a horrified audience. On November 9th, 1888, the violence reached an unimaginable peak with the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, often considered the Ripper's final canonical victim. Unlike the previous outdoor attacks, Mary Jane was killed indoors, in her tiny room at 13 Miller's Court. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, Irish, and working as a sex worker. That morning, her landlord's assistant looked through the broken window and saw a nightmare. Mary Jane's body had been horrifically mutilated. The killer had time and privacy to unleash his full brutality. The crime scene shocked even hardened investigators. Some refused to describe it in detail. The level of disfigurement suggested a personal, almost frenzied hatred toward the victim, or toward women like her. After this, the murders that clearly fit the Ripper's pattern abruptly stopped. Whether he died, was imprisoned for another crime, emigrated, or simply chose to stop remains one of the darkest riddles of the case. From today's perspective, the investigation into Jack the Ripper seems chaotic, even incompetent. But the police faced enormous challenges. 2 forces shared responsibility: the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police, each with different jurisdictions and rivalries. Coordination was poor, so information and clues weren't always shared effectively. Forensic science was in its infancy. Fingerprinting wasn't in use, DNA was unimaginable, and crime scene preservation was minimal. Crowds of onlookers contaminated scenes, evidence was handled casually, and crucial items were sometimes removed or cleaned before thorough documentation. Detectives conducted hundreds of interviews, followed countless leads, and placed plainclothes officers on the streets. But under intense media scrutiny and political pressure, mistakes multiplied. The infamous Goulston Street graffito, potentially a key clue, was erased on a senior officer's orders before it could be properly studied. The result was a sprawling, fragmented investigation that generated mountains of paper and few solid answers. One frustrating aspect of the Ripper case is that even the victim list is debated. Most experts agree on 5 canonical victims: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Their murders share key features: nighttime attacks, similar victim profiles, brutal throat cuts, and escalating mutilations. However, several other women killed in Whitechapel around that time might also have been victims. These include Martha Tabram, found stabbed dozens of times in August 1888, and later cases where mutilation or throat cutting occurred. Some researchers argue the Ripper's work has been artificially narrowed to the most sensational crimes, while others insist that lumping all East End violence together muddies the pattern. The truth may sit somewhere in between. What is clear is that the murders were not isolated freak events. They occurred in a landscape already soaked in violence against poor women, a crucial context often overshadowed by the killer's lurid legend. Over the years, a parade of suspects has marched through books, documentaries, and conspiracy theories, some plausible, many absurd. Among the more serious candidates is Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish barber living in the East End, who reportedly exhibited violent, delusional behavior and was later committed to an asylum. Some modern researchers, using contested DNA evidence from a shawl, have pointed to him. Another popular suspect is Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher whose suicide shortly after the final canonical murder fueled speculation. There's also Leather Apron John Pizer, initially suspected but later cleared. More sensational theories drag in royalty and famous figures: Prince Albert Victor, royal physicians, artists like Walter Sickert. These tend to rely on speculation, weak timelines, and class anxieties rather than hard evidence. Despite generations of investigation, no suspect has been conclusively proven. Each candidate tells us as much about our fears and biases as about the real killer. Modern science has repeatedly tried to crack the Ripper mystery, with mixed results. Some studies claim DNA from a shawl found near Catherine Eddowes points to Aaron Kosminski. Critics counter that the shawl's provenance is dubious, contamination is likely, and the methodologies aren't peer-reviewed. Criminal profilers have built psychological portraits of the killer: a white male in his late 20s to early 40s, likely local to Whitechapel, familiar with the streets and comfortable moving in the slums. The mutilations suggest deep-seated misogyny, possible sexual sadism, and maybe a background in slaughterhouses or crude medical work. Geographic profiling, the mapping of crime locations to infer a killer's home base, also indicates a small area in or near Whitechapel as his likely residence. Yet each new scientific breakthrough ends up contested, raising as many questions as it answers. More than a century later, the trail is still cold, just slightly better illuminated by modern tools. Beyond the gore and mystery, the Jack the Ripper case exposes the social fault lines of Victorian Britain. The victims were poor, middle-aged, often alcoholic women living precarious lives. To much of respectable society, they were invisible until their deaths became front-page spectacles. The intense focus on the killer overshadowed systemic neglect. Brutal working conditions, lack of housing, inadequate health care, and moralistic attitudes toward sex work. The Ripper became a convenient symbol of evil, diverting attention from everyday violence against marginalized women. At the same time, the case transformed crime reporting. Sensational headlines, lurid illustrations, and serialized coverage sold papers and helped invent modern tabloid journalism. The idea of the celebrity killer was born. When we talk about Jack the Ripper, we're also talking about how societies respond to fear: who gets protected, who gets blamed, and whose suffering becomes a story rather than a reason to change the world that allowed it. Stepping back from the grisly details, a few key points stand out. First, Jack the Ripper was not a supernatural genius. He exploited darkness, overcrowded streets, and the social invisibility of his victims. His success in avoiding capture says as much about the limitations and prejudices of Victorian policing as about his own cunning. Second, the myth has often overshadowed the reality. The victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were real women with families, histories, and struggles. Remembering their humanity pushes back against the killer's grim celebrity. Third, the case marks a turning point in both criminology and media. It fueled advances in investigative thinking while also launching a style of sensational true crime coverage that we still grapple with today. And finally, its enduring mystery forces us to examine our fascination with violent men and to ask whether we're more interested in monsters than in the societies that breed them. If this dive into the world of Jack the Ripper helped you see the case in a deeper way, not just as a gory mystery, but as a window into Victorian society, consider sticking around for more long-form history and true crime breakdowns. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss upcoming episodes where we tackle other infamous cases, from solved modern investigations to centuries-old cold files. Drop a comment with the theory you find most convincing, or tell me if you think the killer's identity even matters, or if the real story is the lives of the victims and the city around them. If you'd like a follow-up episode on specific suspects, forensic debates, or a walking tour of the modern Whitechapel sites, let me know. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone who loves history told with a critical eye. Thanks for watching, and for remembering the people behind the legend.